It is my honor to welcome you today to this webinar on randomized evaluation in humanitarian action to mark the launch of the learning agenda for JPAL's new humanitarian initiative. Today in this webinar, we will, if we can move to the next slide, please, Kilian. Share an introduction to JPAL, just to put everybody on the same page, as well as the humanitarian initiative that I just mentioned. We'll mark the launch of the learning agenda with a panel discussion with interventions from Deborah, who's representing FCDO today, from Schuler Allen and Luke Bergel, who are both researchers from the JPAL network. And then we'll hear from Fiona Terry, who works with the ICRC, on their complementary perspectives and why this research is important and what they hope to learn from it for the future. We'll then open the floor for Q&A with whatever questions you may have. Maybe some of you have already had a look at the learning agenda that we published last Friday. And we'll end on a few points that give you an intuition about how we can engage on the realization of this learning agenda together. And with this, Kilian, I invite you as the Director of Policy for JPAL Europe to share some background information on JPAL and the Humanitarian Initiative.
Thank you, Teresa. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody who's joining us today, and thanks for taking the time. I thought I'd start by providing a little bit of an introduction to the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, for those of you who may be less familiar. We are a global research organization that's composed of 260 affiliated professors who are based at universities all around the world. These are just some of those who are based here in Europe, and all of whom use randomized evaluations to inform policy. So all of these professors use lots of different types of research to kind of advance their own research agenda, but what brings the network together is a dedication, a commitment to using randomized evaluations to ensure that policy is backed by scientific evidence. We do this in a few different ways. We have staff all around the world who engage in three sort of broad areas of action. The first is, of course, the research itself. So we try to generate funding for innovative new research, all of it either randomized evaluations or research that leads to randomized evaluations. And we support in different ways carrying out research affiliates projects on the ground. We also engage in quite a bit of capacity building, leading executive trainings and developing rigorous online courses to make our research more accessible to large audiences, and also to build up the pipeline of researchers who are able to use these methods in their work everywhere in which we work. Finally, the area that we work in the policy team here at JPAL Europe and our other offices, we sort of try to apply the lessons from this research. So that means synthesizing the research results in items like the learning agenda, which we'll discuss today, building partnerships with different kinds of actors, be they government ministries or non-governmental organizations, to help them think about how to use the findings from those research, and to provide technical assistance to actually assist in applying those research insights. Everything we do has sort of in mind as the end goal being able to support scale. So a lot of the evaluations that we run are done so with the eye towards thinking about what kind of evidence do we need to produce that will allow us to both actually change policies and programs, to think about how they might be redesigned, and also where we find evidence of impact to actually support the scaling of those interventions so they can reach large audiences. So here you see on this slide just a visual representation of how people have been reached by programs and policies that were informed by evaluations led by the JPAL network. So programs or policies that were actually scaled up after an evaluation was run. Often many evaluations were run showing evidence of impact. And that's the kind of work that we'd like to bring with others to the humanitarian sector, and that we'll be talking about today. I mentioned that we run research all around the world. There's now over 1,100 randomized evaluations that have either been launched or completed in 91 countries. Some of the sectors in which the research has been the most prolific include agriculture, education, and health. But we also have new research in areas like political economy and governance, in gender, and in crime, violence, and conflict, among others. Hopefully you can read the legend there at the bottom of your screen. We cultivate a deep local presence through a network of 7 different regional offices across the world. We're speaking to you today from JPAL Europe, which is based at the Paris School of Economics. And I'll just take one moment to tell you about the work that we do at JPAL Europe. We wear two different hats. The first one is actually generating evidence for social policy in Europe. And there the network has launched over 90 evaluations in 21 European countries. A large number of those focus on labor market policies, thinking about how to connect people to high quality work opportunities, education, trying to improve both access to and the quality of education across Europe, and social inclusion with a strong focus in particular on migrants and refugees within Europe. And if you'd like to learn more, we sort of sum up some of the insights from across that work at the link that you'll see on the right on our website. The second hat that we wear, and sort of one of the hats that we're wearing today in this webinar, is applying evidence with humanitarian and development actors based here in Europe. So thinking about how to actually draw on the randomized evaluations and rigorous evidence that have been generated elsewhere in the world to inform development programming and development strategy. So that means both working with large state actors and development funders, but also with humanitarian and development practitioners to think about maybe an evaluation that they've run themselves, or maybe an evaluation that seems relevant to their work and that should be drawn on when thinking about generating sort of evidence-backed programs. I think I probably don't have to tell you too much about why we think randomized evaluations are a powerful tool if you've joined us today, but just a few that we think are particularly relevant to launching this work in the humanitarian sector. The most obvious and probably the most cross-cutting being that well-designed randomized evaluations really allow us to isolate the causal impacts of interventions and programs. It's quite an intensive form of research, and the reason that we think it's worthwhile is when we really want to understand what was the causal impact of the program itself. They tell us not just whether programs work, but actually provide rich insight into the mechanisms that lead to change. So not just did it work, but how did it work and why? They allow us to rigorously test the effectiveness of different kinds of program models, which we think is particularly relevant in the sector. So not necessarily comparing nothing to something, but instead different ways of providing something. And they also help us think more about effective program design, how to move to scale, and act as a powerful tool for mobilizing resources when we have proven evidence of impact. And then just very briefly to introduce the exercise that we've been engaged in over the past year in trying to sort of set up an enabling environment for more randomized evaluation in humanitarian action. We wanted to approach this field relatively slowly. And that was in part because we wanted to hear about existing research that exists in the field. There are some randomized evaluations. There's also a huge wealth of other types of research, other types of evaluation or other research that we can draw on and that we actually look at in the learning agenda. And you'll hear more about this later in terms of providing inspiration for the kind of questions that randomized evaluations can answer. So that's why we built in a long period of consultations with practitioners and funders of this work to understand where the demand for the work actually was, what questions did they want to answer, and where did we think randomized evaluations could be particularly useful versus where would other types of research be more useful. We led a training in November trying to provide the sort of fundamentals of rigorous evaluation in this sector. And we also led an incubator in March, which you'll hear a bit more about, which actually tried to start with teams that had questions, paired them up with researchers and helped them think through a lot of the basics and some of the not so basics of actually getting this work launched. And then finally, the thing that we'll talk about the most today is the learning agenda itself. And here what we really wanted to do was create sort of a common vocabulary between practitioners, particularly practitioners in the area of humanitarian protection, and to help them think about what randomized evaluations might have to add. And the reverse as well, how researchers could think about what the sorts of policy questions were in this area to which they might bring the expertise and the method. And our hope, as Tessa will tell you about later in the call, is to launch a call for proposals for research in this space later this year. Just very quickly, this work builds on earlier work in governance, crime reduction, and peace building, where there's been a major expansion in the use of randomized evaluations. Since 2017, JPAL and our partner organization, Innovations for Poverty Action, or IPA, have been working to develop and launch this work. It's supported by a major grant from FCDO, producing research in over 33 countries. And I think it sort of paved the way in terms of investing in generating RCT evidence in fragile contexts and on previously unexplored themes where there was a sense that maybe randomized evaluations would be too difficult to launch. So I'd encourage you to look at this resource, which we put together, which explores in detail a lot of the different ways in which randomized evaluations have been used that might be a little bit unexpected. And then what you'll see today, and which I think we shared with you by email, but you can also access on our website, is this guide, which it's not really a white paper because this is an area where the rigorous evidence base is relatively narrow, but instead it outlines what the priority questions are, as I mentioned, how to respond to growing needs more effectively, and how to build in protection, and particularly thinking about how protection programming or work that sort of seeks to generate protection outcomes, thinking about what the theories of change behind those programs are and how we can test them. Provides guidance on how we traditionally use randomized impact evaluations to sort of ask questions about cost effectiveness, innovation, and scale, and how we might tailor those for humanitarian settings. And then, as I mentioned, draws on existing evidence and researchers' experience in this area to give us an intuition for what promising avenues for future research might be for using randomized evaluations. I'll hand it back to you now, Teresa.
Thank you, Kilian, for starting us off. One thing I must make some brief brackets for housekeeping that I did skip before. So far that one of the things worked well. You will have your microphones off, so thank you for that. You will have noticed that we are recording this. And now while we move to the remarks by the different panelists, I invite you to start putting your questions in the Q&A functions that you will find at the bottom of your screen, I think for most of you, that we will then draw on to inform the Q&A that we move towards after each of the four you see here will have given their perspective on this type of research that we're launching. So please feel free to put your questions there. So moving to the panel discussion part of this webinar, as you will have heard from, or as you heard just now from Kilian, this type of research is a collaborative effort, and even building the learning agenda has been an exercise in drawing the different perspectives of practitioners and researchers together to build something that hopefully provides a basis for meaningful research in the future. So therefore, also today in this event, we invited different people to speak to their perspective about why they think this is important and maybe what they learned so far already from engaging in this research. So we'll start with Deborah Baglol, who is a humanitarian advisor at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, who, as Kilian already said, has been investing both in research on governance, crime and conflict before, and now has been providing the funding for this and is likely to fund future research as well. So Deborah, with this, can I invite you to share some of the intuition behind why FCDO thinks this is important and what you hope to gain from this in the future?
Thanks, Teresa. Thank you for the presentation, Kilian, and thank you to colleagues on the panel. I'm very happy and excited to be here today to talk about the Humanitarian Initiative. And Teresa, thank you for pronouncing my surname correctly, because that very rarely happens, so well done. As Kilian's already explained, FCDO has been working with JPAL over a period of a couple of years, looking at RCTs in more difficult contexts, particularly in conflict and crime contexts. And it was through that collaboration really that FCDO in the humanitarian research team where I work, that we wanted to explore, is this now something that we could think about for humanitarian protection? And through quite a few conversations over a period of time, we've managed to get to the point where we are now, where we've completed what we've called this inception period of 6 months, and have produced the learning agenda, which we were really happy to receive, and I think everyone will agree is really good food for thought in the sector. For us, I think at FCDO, it's been quite important for a few years now to put, or try to contribute to put some evidence base behind protection programming. Back in 2013, I think it was, we asked JPBI in Berlin to do some piece of research for us to look at what's the evidence base on what works in protection programming, to give us some ideas about what was out there. And what that piece of work found was that actually the evidence base was quite weak. And that wasn't a surprise to any of us, but it did help to crystallize our thinking that we really needed to do quite a lot more to contribute to the humanitarian sector to try and put a solid evidence base behind what types of interventions lead to effective protection outcomes. So we were really happy to kick off this inception phase with JPAL. And I think it's really important for us as well, not just putting an evidence base behind what we do in protection, because we all want better outcomes for people affected by conflict and crisis, but because it's no secret that at FCDO we've had to reduce our ODA budget in the last year or so, because we have dropped our contribution down to 0.5% due to COVID. So it's even more important for us to make sure that the interventions that we fund and the partners that we fund are undertaking protection programming that is really effective and that is good value for money for the British taxpayer who funds it. So at FCDO, we have a portfolio of research on humanitarian protection. I won't go into it now, but it's quite easily available on our website. And I think what's been really important for us in this partnership with JPAL is to add to that portfolio something that is a methodology that is different, is not usually used in humanitarian contexts, I think it's fair to say, and certainly not used in humanitarian protection. So this is a very exciting adventure for us. We feel like we're on a journey. But we're obviously very keen to see what we can help partners do, what kinds of interventions partners bring to the table, and what the results are from trialling RCTs on those interventions. The only other thing I'd say is that I think the learning agenda itself has raised some really interesting points. And I think for humanitarian actors, I think it's going to be particularly important to look at some of the issues raised around the ethics of doing these kinds of research interventions, particularly in humanitarian contexts, where humanitarian principles come into play, and where things like the randomisation that is necessary plays out with impartiality, and how that sits with humanitarian partners. I think this is raised in the learning agenda, and I think that's going to be a really key question as we go forward. So just thanks again for inviting me, and I'm very happy and keen to hear the kinds of questions that are put to us by the audience and hear what the other panelists have to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for sharing some of that reason for being that we're here. With this, I think we'll move to now one of the JPAL affiliates, Luc Bergel. And I hope I'm also pronouncing that name correctly, actually. So you, Luc, have been providing an immense amount of really useful guidance to us from an academic perspective, and understanding and kind of shaping our understanding of researchers' questions, and how existing evidence may give us directions through which we can answer or start answering some of those questions. And I think one of our questions to you is whether there's anything in particular that you learned from this engagement, anything that surprised you, anything that you think should be pointed out in specific.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Teresa. What I would like to share actually is that I already learned a lot. So you told me that I provided guidance, and that's good to hear. But I must say I also learned a lot, and I felt it was very interesting and actually inspiring to hear the questions from the humanitarian organization. So if you look a little bit at the learning agenda, it really starts from the questions that practitioners in the field raised. And I thought that this question, for some of them, did not surprise me. For some of them did surprise me. But the overall picture is that I felt a true willingness to learn, and to learn from impact evaluation, among other means. And to me, that really signaled a willingness to step back on some of the interventions that can be led in this sector to measure impacts. And I think it's important when you measure impacts to clearly see why you want to measure impact. One, maybe, it's just by accountability, you want to show that you're doing, or it may be because you want to learn. You believe there are different ways to do things and you want to improve, you want to innovate. And I think there's a lot of this second case, and I think that's super interesting, and for researchers it's exciting. And I think it's also promising for action. So just to give a few examples, some of the questions we heard about may sound very familiar in other settings, in development economics in general. So some are, how do we target the right recipients for a given intervention? How do we combine different components, for instance, when we have cash transfer as a way to provide support, but we can combine that with more specific intervention, mental health interventions, for instance. How do we appropriately combine this kind of intervention? So this somehow are fairly standard question, but of course you need to answer that taking into due consideration the specific context. And I think impact evaluation is in that case important. Some of the questions were more specific to the humanitarian sectors, and there are two that really attracted my attention. One is about anticipatory actions. And so, we may now forecast, imperfectly, but we may forecast some shocks, for instance, climatic shocks, or we may even anticipate that there will be, if not wars, fighting in some areas. So can we take advantage of this to anticipate on actions, to help people in advance to prepare humanitarian interventions? And what are the trade-offs involved? Because we may get it wrong, and so we may invest where, in the end, we don't need to invest. We may also, in some cases, help people that we wouldn't have helped otherwise. Is it a good idea or not? Because this shock did not, in the end, materialize. How does all of this depend on the quality of a forecast? So I think this is a very, very promising area, and there is a lot to learn. Another type of question that attracted my attention is the focus on, or at least the question of localization. That is, should we try to deliver assistance by local host communities or by the vulnerable communities themselves? What can we gain? How do we do that? And that's, again, is a familiar questions in other contexts. But in the humanitarian setting, where communities may be disorganized, where there is networks may collapse, etc., that raises very important and difficult questions. And so can we leverage these local capacities, and how? So these are just a few examples of questions I heard, and I felt were interesting. And in fact, this mix of new and old questions to revisit, I believe, is very consistent with the way I see a research initiative such as the Humanitarian Initiative. The idea is that we take stock of existing evidence. We see how and under what condition it can be used in a specific context, whether it can or not be extrapolated. And by doing all this, we put ourselves in a global learning process. And to me, that's a very important thing. Why do we need a research initiative? Because we believe learning is a public good. And even though we want to learn in specific context, and typically humanitarian protection is a very specific context, we aim to do that in specific crises, in specific instances, but in a way that can teach us lessons that can be useful tomorrow. So I think that's really the philosophy of the learning agenda. And I was really thrilled to see that the questions raised by practitioners really lend themselves to this approach.
Thank you, Luc, for that summary. That actually does get me even a little bit more excited about our work than I was before. With this, let me move to Schuler, who will speak a little bit to the feasibility of humanitarian, of randomized evaluations in humanitarian settings. And this also, so the question here comes to a researcher who has, over the past engaged quite substantially in research in displacement affected contexts, so mostly in southern Turkey, where there's a lot of refugee populations who crossed over from Syria. So Schuler, with that, from your experience, and also looking back on your engagement with practitioners over the past month, how do you think now about the feasibility of randomized evaluations in humanitarian settings? And we can also keep that for later, but I think Deborah already primed us nicely for the question of ethics and how we think about ethics. So if there's anything you'd like to expand on there, I'd very much invite you to do so.
So thank you, Tessa. For someone who has been engaged in this type of research in crisis settings and post-crisis settings, our conversations with the practitioners and the humanitarian actors over the last few months highlighted certain challenges and highlighted certain questions they have in terms of running a credible evaluation in this space. So, and that they were almost all of them, I must say, almost all of them are actually the challenges we always face as soon as we want to put an interesting idea to the test in a challenging field, like a post-conflict or conflict field. And then we also have to coordinate with multiple stakeholders. So those challenges are not just RCT challenges or any or research challenges, but those or humanitarian challenges, but they are challenges for running research in this kind of space. So just to give you a few examples, and then of course we also, as you see in the learning agenda, we also consider some strategies to tackle those challenges and drawing insights from what we have learned working in this field in different settings, and that can all be considered as crisis settings or conflict settings. So one of the things that the practitioners raise is this short term and the go nature of the humanitarian programming when the crisis actually sets in, and then that the speedy nature just may make designing a credible research around this short term and fast programming. So it is true in this space, this type of programming can go really fast and can be rolled out really fast. And then researchers have to be a lot more flexible in terms of designing and deploying a research design to actually measure the effectiveness of such fast-moving programming. So for this, it's not like we're not used to this. A lot of programs in conflict settings that I work in as well work really fast and go really fast. And then we do have the one way we deal with this is having pre-designs and good outcomes already we are interested in and we know how to measure. So we can actually deploy those really fast in these areas. Another thing that is not unique to humanitarian RCTs or humanitarian program evaluation is, but it can be more acute for humanitarian programming evaluation, is the funding mismatch. Again, the programs roll fast. Even if you're very flexible as a researcher to deploy a good research design, try to measure all the outcomes that the practitioners and the researchers are interested in, then your funding may not be there. So it may not be as fast flowing. So one of the things that's raised by the actors that we have been talking to is this funding mismatch. And then of course, there are certain strategies we can come up with, and it's like a pre-commitment and pre-allocate your funding for this type of evaluation. Another issue that they raised, and we already knew in other RCT contexts, is contamination. And it's particularly acute in this field, and I work in this field, I know, because as soon as I go into the field, I see a lot of other actors all around me trying to do other things, trying to do similar things, complementary things, and all that stuff. So then you actually are in a field, in a very, very crowded field. We are always worried about contamination when we try to replicate the laboratory in the field. We always have worry, we are always worried about contamination, but it is more acute, of course, in the humanitarian setting. So you have multiple actors trying to do multiple things, and you try to evaluate one single program. One way to deal with is, of course, better coordination. You know, in any RCT would require a lot of coordination across stakeholders, and in humanitarian settings, you may need to have a lot more coordination with these humanitarian actors as well. Another thing you could do is that actually RCTs can provide actually value here, because just to give you an example, in my case, and I'm measuring an effectiveness of a particular program where UNICEF is running a lot of programming in kind of a blanket way. So then it will actually go back to Deborah's point about the ethical approach or ethical challenges that actually people attach to RCTs, is that what we say is in the humanitarian space, most of the time, our control condition is what has been happening in the field already. So it's like a drug trial that you never actually have a pure control. You never go after a pure control. What you actually go after is with the traditional drug, or what UNICEF is doing in my case. So it's kind of an A and B testing, and testing a single program against what has been the other actors are doing. So it's actually not a huge challenge in that sense. I mean, contamination is a challenge, but you can actually go around it with the RCT way better than the other methods in this case, and this has been my also experience. There are other challenges they bring about. I don't want to sit down and pretend that everything in the humanitarian programming space is RCTable. There are programs, there are small scale programs, and there are programs that you cannot collect meaningful outcomes. You cannot run an RCT. It's for sure. But what we learned over the last few years, and also I learned quite a bit, is that there are so many programs that you can actually evaluate through RCTs, and I hope the practitioners right now are more and more convinced that this is also possible. I don't want to go through all the other challenges that they raise, and one of the things they also raise is this, you know, again, it's not unique to humanitarian programming, is what I would say the compliance, but also like going after a target, but your final target is not that target. For example, in the protection space, you want to run an intervention on an armed forces with the interest of the final outcome, or improving the protection outcome of some displaced populations, or children or women, for example. So in that case, in the humanitarian setting, it may be difficult to monitor these layers. But in those cases, we have ways to deal with it, like slicing out the program evaluation in the intermediate outcome phase, and in the final outcome phases. We have evidence, we have basically know-how how to deal with those types of problems. Of course, there are new ones that will always come in this kind of crisis setting, but so much know-how will help how to tackle these issues. Lastly, I want to say about running a responsible and ethical RCT, and it is true, again, it's going back to the drug trials or medical procedure trials. Often what we are searching for, or what RCT is searching for, is not excluding people from a particular program. It's usually to deal with the issue of impartiality and making sure people have access to good programs, or, you know, untested, but hoping that it's going to be good type of programs, is to, for example, testing different modalities of the same program. So do we know how to deploy a program or roll out a program A in a way that is more effective. And again, we can test these. We can test this without a pure control, in the sense that some people will never have this program or have access to this program. In some cases, pure control is a policy relevant outcome. It will give you policy relevant evaluation, but in the humanitarian setting, it's not even the case. In the humanitarian crisis setting, what we are interested is often is a new approach, new modality, new targeting system, new delivery method against what has been done and what the other actors have been doing. So in that sense, RCTs are a way to go, or not not kind of, I don't want to say unethical, but obviously, but you understand what I mean, that it is actually helpful in terms of finding what is the most effective way of doing what we have been already doing, right? And the phase-in designs are also addressing this issue. Like, you know, if you have a resource constraint, you can treat certain type of people at some point, and then you can just roll it out slowly to actually make sure that everybody accesses the program eventually. So overall, I would like to summarize. I'd like to summarize what I have been saying, that the challenges that the practitioners raised, and then we try to provide some strategies to combat those, are not really unique to the humanitarian settings. It's just the nature of running RCTs, but they may be more acute. They may require more flexibility on the researcher side and also on the funder side, but feasible. I should add it.
I think that's a great. That's an absolutely great summary. Thank you so much, Shula. Maybe to just pick up on some of the wording that was used in the question in the Q&A around the ethics part. So what you're saying is that an RCT that does not necessarily, or in the humanitarian space, probably in many cases not at all, imply withholding assistance. So that's maybe an outdated misconception about what a randomized evaluation entails. So we don't need a pure control group, or we don't need to withhold assistance for meaningful research. So I hope that already answered the question that we have right now in the chat. If you do have questions, I would encourage you to put them there now. I don't think we'll have a lot of time to get through them, but so if you have a question that you want answered, please put it there now so we can prioritize it. And with that, I would move to Fiona, who's joining us, I think, from Geneva today. She's the head of ICRC's Center for Operational Research and Expertise. She has been with us in this process since when I joined JPAL, I think you were one of the first meetings I had with one of the external parties. So you've really seen the work that we did over the past month. And so we'd be very curious to hear from you what you took away from that. Is there anything that surprised you, that you learned? I understand you may be engaging with JPAL affiliates, with researchers over the coming month to build an RCT on one of the ICRC's programs. So it will also be interesting to hear from you why that is, and why you think this is worth all the coordination and stakeholder management and so forth that we mentioned so far. Please.
Thanks, Tessa. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I am a bit of a cheerleader now, because I really have enjoyed this adventure very much. And my learning curve has been so incredibly strong. If Luke thinks he's learned a few things, let me tell you, I've learned a lot more. So, so firstly, you know, the questions that the JPAL came with, or asking us our questions, are really questions that we've had for a long time. In particular, as most of you hopefully know, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, a lot of our work is in the field of preventing violations of international humanitarian law. But how do you assess the effectiveness of prevention when the outcome is that something doesn't happen? So this has been for us a question for a while. How do we assess the outcomes of our protection and prevention work? And I think it's really important to reiterate what Sule said, which is not every program is amenable to an RCT, which we've discovered as we've gone through this process of really thinking through what kind of programs can we assess with this methodology. So one of my big takeaways, firstly, is the model that you guys have of JPAL. I think it's unique. I think it's exceptional. I think it's really, really needed to bringing academics and practitioners together with JPAL in the middle, translating academic speak and academic papers into something that's very accessible to people. So I think it's really fascinating to look at some of the very relevant RCTs that have been done in the past. I'm thinking of the one in Liberia, looking at cognitive behavioral therapy and cash as ways of stopping fighters or discouraging young men at risk to go back and to join armed groups. This kind of study is fantastic. So I think there's already, thanks to you, a lot out there that we can tap into to try to understand what we should be thinking about, what we should be looking at. And then, so there was the review, and then the incubator that we did in Paris was so useful. I was really fortunate enough to be with 3 fantastic colleagues. Each of us had different expertise to bring to the table. And I think that was very important because each of us had different elements of knowledge about what goes on in the field, which of course is extremely important. But we did try to put together an RCT that we're still working on to look at our accompaniment program for families of missing people, where we run an MHPSS, a mental health and psychosocial program. And we wanted to understand what impact that has on results on stress, on anxiety, on people's ability to function without this family member who, they don't know what's happened to the family member. And then what would be the difference if we also added cash into that mix? And of course, in both cases, we also add the protection part, which is to explain to people what their rights are and where they can access help. So this is, for us would be very, very interesting and would have a very big impact on our programs in the future, because if we really found that adding cash to the MHPSS program made the outcomes much better because people were more relaxed, they had more time when their basic needs were being taken care of, they weren't worrying about where the next meal was coming from or the job or the money they're not earning, then that would be extremely useful for us. So for us, we're very enthusiastic about randomized control trials. We do realize the complexity and the challenges in the field, especially when we are moving with mobile populations. And, in the ICRC, we do work in mostly conflict affected areas. And so at any time we can have a population suddenly disappear and not be able to know where they've gone. But I know, Sule, you had that same problem in Turkey. So it's not, as you say, it's not insurmountable just for the humanitarian community. But yes, I think this has been a really great experience having the academics to help us and to listen to us and not make us feel foolish when we can't quite grasp the mathematics of it all has been really fantastic. So I hope we continue this journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. This was really nice to hear, of course. I dare say a little bit expected, otherwise we would have, of course, not invited you, but it's still really good to hear. And so with this, we've heard some intuitions from all of you. I think we have a few questions in the chat, and I might want to go back to one that is very much about the why would we do an RCT in this space, and maybe Luc, if you wouldn't mind having a look at that. So the question, because you mentioned the localization and kind of working with the affected populations aspect a little bit. So the question here is, what is the role of affected populations in designing monitoring and evaluation of protection programs in specific, and why would we need RCTs? Wouldn't feedback from affected populations, wouldn't that be sufficient? So maybe it's both a question of why do we do an RCT, and if you have thoughts on the role of the voices of affected people in what is usually considered quantitative research. I think that would be really interesting to hear from you.
Sure. No, that's a great question. And I think that the first thing to say is I don't think the perceptions of the people concerned by the programs will be of the affected populations will be sufficient. But I think it is necessary as much as we can to involve this population. So in the design, in some form of evaluation, but what you need to realize is that evaluating the impact of a program is often very difficult because you need to make an assessment of, alternatives to it. So you may be very satisfied with something. Okay, you received a cash transfer or you received some support and you're super enthusiastic vis-a-vis the program. Does it mean that it is the best program you can have? Well, for that, you need a comparison point. And that's probably where really the value of an RCT is. So you may realize lots of interesting things by asking people, and they may give you good ideas to improve the program. But to be sure that you have an assessment of the impact of the program requires more. And it's good to acknowledge that in general, we are not in a position to make an assessment of not only how things worked in this specific setting, but how they would have worked in other settings. And that's an empirical question. You may have ideas, you may have opinions on that. That's for sure, and people have plenty of opinions. But if you make the exercise of actually measuring the alternatives, then you may learn and you may be surprised. And I've been surprised many times. And I think I've had practitioners who engaged with me in some evaluation and they were surprised at the end. So it doesn't mean that their knowledge is irrelevant. It is that their knowledge can be leveraged and brought to something more by taking this approach. So yeah, involvement. I mean, sometimes there is a discourse that people know what they need and typically they would pay for it. Okay, is that really true? I mean, if we had this logic, people wouldn't go for vaccination. Does it mean vaccination is bad? They know it's so we know we can leverage what people know in the field, but we need more than simply this.
Thank you so much. I don't know if any of the other panelists have other thoughts or additional thoughts on this. Yes, Fiona, please.
Yes, I would just add to that something that we find in our research in the ICRC is how do you get around the bias? I mean, if you go and ask a population about the activities that you've been giving to them, how do you get around the fact that they might think, well, we'll be cut off if we don't give the right answer. So we're going to have to tell them what we think they want to hear. And so that's where I find that these experimental methodologies, whether in surveys or through a randomized control trial, are really interesting when it's, when you can try to get around this bias as much as possible.
Yes, Schuler, please.
I can add to that is like the need for hard outcomes. People might say, oh, this is a great program. I really enjoyed it, but we would like to see the effect of that program in the tangible outcomes. For example, if we are targeting child outcomes, if we are targeting, say, food security, we would like to see this, and we would like to be able to measure this so that we see the program is actually working, rather than making people happy in a way that that is maybe social desirability bias, but maybe also that they want to be in the program. They just want to be in the program, so they don't want to say anything wrong. So, but from the policy perspective, we are interested in whether this is actually effective and it's actually affecting any of the hard outcomes that we are interested in, so that the cost that we are incurring is actually worthwhile. If it's not worthwhile because we can actually do something else for these people, that is more beneficial. So that's why it's important to evaluate the programs in a rigorous way.
Okay, thank you so much, Schuler. Sorry, I was just distracted by a follow-up question that came into the chat. I think it's about, if I understand correctly, it's about how we deal with social desirability bias in this type of research. And I think that is actually, as that is a question that is more broad in the sense that this is a question that doesn't only affect humanitarian settings. It's of course any type of M&E activity. I'd maybe pause that for a second now and ask, and I think Also because I think there's quite some literature on that we're very happy to share with you. So if whoever asked the question, I think Ben Bella, if you'd like to shoot me an email, we're happy to share some resources about how JPAL thinks about that, what JPAL did in the past, or affiliates did in the past to deal with this. And with that, I'm looking at Kilian maybe to see if there's anything he would like to share about how we think right now an RFP may be structured to support research in a field that has usually shorter funding cycles, and what reflections we have on that. I'll quickly look at you if that is something you would like to share, or otherwise I'll answer.
I probably don't have all the details that the questioner is looking for right now, but as kind of came up a few times in the beginning of the webinar, it is something we're trying to think about, both the timing of when we make funding available, as the question kind of alludes to, are we able to make a quicker decision on awarding those grants? One thing that we've been discussing with a few different partners is also, is there an argument for pre-designing a lot of the evaluation such that you have a good design of an evaluation that is ready, not exactly ready to go, but nearly ready to go. If you have, for example, an emergency response intervention that you need to roll out, but it's often similar in a lot of different contexts, is it worth starting to think about designing the evaluation in advance, lining up some of the funding in advance, and then sort of working out exactly where you're going to apply it, and doing some of the last stages of making sure that, of course, that it's well adapted to the setting in which you're rolling it out. I think we're talking a lot about sort of how to best support funding in this area. The other thing that we're trying to think about is how can we sometimes make a longer term commitment, and we talk quite a bit about this in the learning agenda as something for our initiative, but also for other research initiatives in this field. Can we make longer term commitments to partners, both in terms of the actual work that we do together, so designing an evaluation sort of pretty far out from the actual intervention starting, trying to find funding together, and maybe breaking it up into different kind of shorter periods rather than just saying, here's one RCT, let's go tomorrow. Actually thinking about how we come back and sort of iterate on design of things, build in what we might learn from a pilot, for example, before we move to a broader evaluation rollout. And then once we have results, actually think about how to use them. Because one thing we haven't said so far, but of course comes up with many partners, both in humanitarian settings and others, is many are worried what happens if we find no evidence of impact of our program, and what can we do together? And I think that's somewhere that organizations like JPAL are sort of committed to actually then thinking, how can you perhaps learn from, well, how can you definitely learn from the results that you do have, but think about redesign, think about scale down, think about moving those resources elsewhere. So it's not a full question to full answer to Tilwicker's question, but we hope to have more details soon.
Thank you for taking that one, Kilian. I think with that, because you also mentioned the question about pilots and then moving to scale, I think that's a nice segue to a question that Tim just put in, that we just got from Tim, about the pathway from impact when it's proven in a pilot or in a program of limited scale, and then how that, sorry, just looking at the question so I reflected correctly. So how that then may need to adapt when moving to scale. And this is maybe something I would like to ask to Schuler, because I know that one of the programs that we really like about perspective taking and how that affects both networks within classrooms in southern Turkey, as well as actually even having impact on the learning ability and the language learning ability of children who recently joined the Turkish schools. Maybe you have some thinking about how that pathway, what that pathway looks like, and how that might differ from other contexts.
So yeah, I mean, generally what the JPAL does, or what is right in other settings, is like you accumulate evidence, like cache evidence, and then you have, the idea is that a lot of people do similar work, all different contexts. So you accumulate evidence and you say, okay, I have now some solid evidence about one particular question, the policy question, and we can now try it or kind of use adopt these programs in different contexts and apply. So in my case, and in the humanitarian case, we're similar as well. This is short-termness, and then and also this the short or fast moving nature of the programming often might force you to get the pilot results. If they are positive, since you have no other alternative in many cases, and try to scale that up in similar contexts, right? So this was my experience in the humanitarian context. I just saw unbelievably good short-term results, and there was an opportunity to scale it up. And then we just move immediately to scale up, meaning that we apply it to all other schools. So it was possible in that sense. Normally you would wait, oh, what happens to the results in the long term? Are they applicable to the other context? Sometimes you just don't have time for that. Sometimes you just don't even have a thought for that. So you just go, this is the program, this is working, and this is the only thing that we know that's working. So we're just going to scale it up. I would say that's the only difference in the humanitarian context. You just have to be just moving fast. Even in the scale-up space, sometimes you do have to.
Brilliant. Thank you, Schuler. So that primes us for moving quickly and also moving on time. So I'll start to wind us down a little bit and move towards the end, as I promised, to the question of how we can work together. And I think Jed's question there is actually a really neat one about how we collaborate or draw on synergies from work that other actors in the evaluation space do. I think you there, Jed, mentioned IPA, the World Bank, or WFP. And I think WFP, if I'm not mistaken, we even have some people in the room right now that we were really happy to also have at the training who shared some of their thoughts on how they structured impact evaluation at WFP and what challenges they encountered, what advice they have. So in that sense, of course, also with the others, I'm just taking that as a very specific example. We do collaborate quite closely, both in terms of capacity building, but of course also in terms of generating complementary evidence, because in the end, it's really the evidence and the future change that counts. In that sense, I think the initiative and the focus area that FCDO asked us to focus on with protection is one where we have found particularly little evidence, and we hope to build evidence in the future. So let me with that share one more slide to leave you with some visuals on this. If I can get it up quickly enough. Yeah, that's the wrong one. Here you go. So in general, we think at JPAL about different ways that we can affect change. These are just a few of them that have been mentioned. We ask questions about scale. What do we do when a program has found no impact? But then also the question of applying research insights, in which case we really draw when this is a process in which we engage with practitioners, where we won't stop at the evidence that is generated in our network. Of course, it's really a broader exercise, as the learning agenda shows as well. So what we look for in the future is really the building more partnerships piece. I think both the high speed that Schuler mentioned a few times, the need for collaboration that we pointed out, makes for an environment in which we want to focus on building and investing in partnerships ahead of the research to really think through those different pieces. So that is, if that is something you're interested in, I think it's something that we're going to do more intensively in the time to come. And if that's something you're interested in that, please do feel free to reach out. That would be both to think about designing evaluations, but also if you have questions about how can we apply evidence in our operations, it's also something that we're very happy to chat about. With that, it is my pleasure to thank you for being with us today. And I look forward to the work that we can do together and gently move towards more and more effective humanitarian action.